I'm Gabriel Sanders, Director of Public Programs here at the museum, and I'd like to welcome you all this evening for our discussion with Yascha Mounk about his new book, Stranger in My Own Country. Those of us who spend our days working in the field of Holocaust studies, and this is a Holocaust museum, tend to regard post-war Germany as a special case. The country of the perpetrators, yes, but there's no European power that even comes close to the level of self-scrutiny and soul-searching that Germans have undertaken. I don't think Yascha Mounk would disagree with me on this score, but what I've learned from his thoughtful, wide-ranging, and eye-opening book is that a self-conscious Germany isn't necessarily the greatest place to grow up Jewish. Indeed, he seems to argue, it's an almost impossible place to grow up Jewish. We'll have a chance to delve more deeply into the question of biography in a minute, but for convention's sake, I'll say that Yascha Mounk was born in Germany to Polish parents, earned bachelor's and master's degrees in England, is a doctoral candidate at Harvard, spends part of his year in Italy, and regards New York as home. I give you Yascha Mounk.
Thank you.
So I'll begin with a straightforward question. How'd you come to write this book?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. The straightforward answer is that I was in a bar with friends in Lower Manhattan, and I was telling stories from my childhood, and they said, "This sounds fascinating, you should write a book about it." But of course, there's a deeper answer, which is that I was born in Germany, and I come from a family that I think is not atypical of many European Jews, in that on the one hand, being Jewish very deeply marked my family, from my grandparents who survived the Shoah while many of their family did not, to my parents who were thrown out of Poland in 1968 for being Jews, as young people. And so obviously being Jewish was always this big question for me. And on the other hand, I did not have a strong religious tradition at all growing up. I didn't even have a strong cultural tradition growing up. And yet, as I was sort of growing older in Germany, being Jewish in some ways became a bigger and bigger topic for me, and became a bigger and bigger obstacle for me feeling German. And so in a way, I guess many people's first books, and this is my first book, is an attempt to try and understand where I'm from and where we got to be where they are now. And to me, the story of how it is that even though my Jewish identity in some ways was quite thin, it did really dominate my process of growing up in a certain kind of way, and ultimately made me want to leave Germany, was something that was a story that I wanted to tell, but also something that I wanted to come to understand for myself.
So now, you led an unconventional life in many respects, even setting aside the Jewish question. You lived in a number of different places. You didn't grow up in your standard nuclear family. I was hoping you could tell us a little about where in Germany it was that you lived, and, where in Germany it was that you lived.
So I was born in Munich, but I grew up being raised by my mother as a single parent, and she's an orchestra conductor. So she changed orchestras a lot and moved around the country. So I was born in Munich, and I lived repeatedly in Munich over the course of my youth. But I also lived in Freiburg and in Kassel and in a place called Maulbronn near Stuttgart, and in a place called Laupheim near Ulm. And so in a sense, I've really sort of, the one advantage, it had many disadvantages. The one advantage it gave me is a sort of odd cross-section of Germany. Not all of Germany, it was mostly southern Germany, but big cities, small towns, villages. And so I feel like I've had experience of what it is to be a Jew in Germany in many different kinds of places.
But not in the Jewish centers, not in what have become the Jewish centers of Germany.
Munich is one of the Jewish centers. I mean, Frankfurt and Berlin are more so than Munich, but Munich is the third biggest Jewish community in Germany. And there was quite a sizable Jewish community. Well, sizable by German standards. I mean, we're talking probably at the time that I lived there as a kid, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 perhaps Jews, but
But you do talk about Laupheim, which is actually interesting for the museum right now. We have an exhibition on the 3rd floor. I suggest that you visit it if you haven't. It's about American Jews who aided in the rescue of European refugees. And one of the stories that's featured is that of Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal Studios, who was a native of Laupheim and preserved very close connections to Laupheim in the 30s and signed affidavits of support for some 300 Laupheim residents. And in fact, the school that you attended in Laupheim was once named after him, though the Nazis unnamed it after him.
They unnamed it, and now since I've left Laupheim, they've renamed it actually. So,
but what's interesting about Laupheim, and you make this explicit in the book, is that there were 0 Jews there when you lived there. And because of that, it offered to you a kind of a flavor of what being Jew, of what German attitudes toward Jews or toward the war might have been in the immediate aftermath. That it was, you suggest that maybe that Laupheim was in a kind of deep freeze and that their attitudes never really got to mature after 45.
yeah, exactly. So I think there's sort of different phases of how Germans have dealt with the past. In the first phase, sort of speaking in terms of broader political, social, cultural history, was in the 50s and 60s, when the past was still a taboo, when most Germans pretended that, yes, Hitler was a bad guy, but, really except for that, there's nothing to atone for, and let's just sort of move on. And in those years, a lot of anti-Semitic attitudes sort of persisted, and there was just also a lot of ignorance about Jews. And I think through the historical accident that I sort of in the early 90s lived in this, quite small provincial town, I could still feel some of the effects of that. And I think Laupheim has actually changed quite a bit since I've been there. They've renamed the school Karl Laemmle Gymnasium again, right? When I was living there, I was in this odd state of nameless limbo. It was just called the school in Laupheim, which no school in Germany is called. It was just odd. But yeah, so when and this is a story that I tell in the book, when I talked in the Times article that came out last week, when I went to my first day of middle school, of gymnasium, at the Karl Laemmle Gymnasium, as it is now, the teacher goes through the list of students, says, Alsbach, Lisa, Catholic or Protestant, just why? It's like, well, I have to sign you up for either Catholic or Protestant religion classes, so which is it? So, Catholic, it was Emily, Johannes, Protestant, I realized they're going to come to me. And because I didn't have a religious identity, and because, even my cultural connection to Judaism was weak in certain ways, I didn't really know what to say. And so eventually the teacher came to me and says, Mounk, Yascha, you mispronounced your name, but we'll skip over that. Catholic or Protestant? I said, well, I don't know, I guess I'm sort of Jewish. And the whole class laughed uproariously. Everybody just was in stitches, which is not the reaction I'd expected. And Johannes Emmerle from the back of the class shouted, we all know that the Jews don't exist anymore. And the teacher had to sort of step in and say, well, there are a few Jews again. So yeah, when I was living in Laupheim, I still felt this sort of really unabashed sort of ignorance and also some sort of experience of anti-Semitism and so on.
The book offers a very thorough and thoughtful account of how Germans have reckoned with the Holocaust in the decades following it. And you outline a number of eras or epochs. And so the first is this kind of deep freeze, this silent period, and then a kind of thaw in the 60s. And I was hoping you could talk about that movement, or you talk about 0 hours, about this desire to draw lines in history and say, well, at this point things started afresh.
Right.
And so there are a few of these, and I was wondering if you could walk us through that movement.
Yeah, so the original 0 hour is 1945, and for example, Ian Baruma has a book that's just out in 1945 that talks about some of that. very persuasively. And that's basically the idea. Look, the Third Reich was this odd, short aberration in German history. It was this horrible moment, but now, you know, Hitler is dead and we're a democracy, and that's it. We can move on. This country is completely different from what happened before. We won't look at the fact that, you know, the ministries are staffed with former Nazis and so on and so forth. And so that was the idea of 1945 as a 0 hour. It's this moment of change and redemption that insulates the present from the past and sort of really means that we don't have to deal with the past anymore. And then in, you know, starting in the early 1960s, and it's a very slow process that I think for much of the public really only becomes a central concern of that in the late 70s, 1979, with the broadcast of Holocaust and then in the 80s. You know, there's a generation of Germans who take reckoning with the past quite seriously, and who really try to face up to what the country did and what that means, and also what that means for their lived reality in the day, for all the senior Nazis who were in senior positions in government and so on and so forth, even in the Federal Republic. And that's a very serious attempt to reckon with the past, which I think in many ways was quite successful, and that's a standard story about Germany that people are aware of right now, that Germany is, you know, unlike Japan, unlike Austria in certain ways, even unlike places like France in certain ways, it's the country that's really dealt with its past. And I think there's truth to that. And there's something very appealing to what happened in those decades. But I think it's led to a sort of new myth. And the idea of 0 hour is one that's standard in historiography. I sort of try to suggest that there's something like a second 0 hour, that for the 68ers who made much of this reckoning of the past happen, their rebellion has itself become this kind of 0 hour, this kind of moment where there's a clean break between the past and the present. And their story is not, well, after 45 Hitler was dead and everything was fine. Their story is, after 45 there was a real continuity with the past, all these senior Nazis were in power and lots of things really weren't very liberal in our society. But thankfully we came along sort of in the 60s and we changed the country, which we did, for the better in many ways. And now, you know, we've been redeemed. And it's this moment of rebellion in the 60s that's sort of a new founding myth. In 45 is the founding myth of the right in Germany, 68 is the founding myth of the left in Germany.
So you talk about how in the early decades there's still this anti-Semitism that goes unexplored, and that the corollary to that is a kind of philo-Semitism that in its own way goes unexplored. And I was wondering if you could talk about that shift.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting and what makes it so difficult in some ways to be a Jew in Germany today is that since there's relatively few Jews even today, more than when I was growing up, it's still relatively few.
What, if we were to talk about the numbers, what are the estimates for what the Jewish population in Germany today?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, it was really less than 30,000 in a country of then 60 million people, from West Germany. So it's 1 Jew per 2,000 people, so you can see that most people just never have met a Jew in their ordinary life. So of course it's fraught with significance and complication when you first have an encounter, very understandable. After '89, the German government quite generously allowed many Jews from the former Soviet Union to immigrate, and a lot of them did, and now the figure is a little complicated. If you count membership in Jewish communities, which is of course a partial measure, there's about 100,000, a little over 100,000. And if you take sort of broader measures of who you can consider Jewish, you end up somewhere between 200, perhaps 250,000. So yeah, so it's been a very big increase since 1989, but it's still a small portion of the country.
So you talk a lot about, and in fact some of the book's funniest moments are the product of people, well-intentioned people who've never encountered Jews, now all of a sudden coming face to face with one, and how you are forced to represent the totality of the Jewish people and the Jewish existence.
Yeah.
And the incredibly fraught consequences of that.
Yeah, exactly. So part of it is that you're sort of a representative of the Jewish people. And that's one of the things that I that I found difficult growing up. I did have the sense that if I'm going to be an asshole to somebody, well, they'll take away from that the Jews are assholes or something like that. I mean, I remember having that in Kuwait Fort when I was 10 or 11 or something like that. And it's kind of, you know, it makes you very nervous. And part of it is that I think how Germans treat Jews and react towards Jews once they find out that you're Jewish is deeply influenced by their own attitude, by the attitude towards the history of their own country. You know, in the moment in the 80s and 90s when a lot of Germans, you know, had this serious struggle with what the past meant to the country and also how they as individuals sort of, what their responsibility was for dealing with this historical phenomenon and so on. And then you entered the room, they sort of wanted to demonstrate to you all of the lessons they thought they had learned from history and a lot of the time, you know, prove to you how especially the nice they're going to be because they realize how horrible the suffering of the Jewish people has been, which, you know, is an admirable attitude in certain kinds of ways. I mean, it comes from a difficult and deep engagement with issues that aren't easy to face up to. But of course, it still leads to all kinds of absurd situations and misunderstandings.
Now, there's a section in your book that kind of ties into some of this absurdity. I think you know what I'm talking about. Would you be willing to read it?
Sure. Yeah, it's so in Germany, you when I was growing up, you had compulsory military service, which you could get out of in various ways. And this is the story of my